people should use in times of crisis, and we will think about that, but I think we'll come to see that that's not the main reason for this passage. First of all, then, notice provision. Provision. We're told of the severity of the famine. There was no food, it says in verse 13, in the whole region because the famine was severe. Both Egypt and Canaan wasted away because of the famine. And 3 times Egypt and Canaan come together in the verses. It's that whole region that's affected. This is the fulfillment of Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams, that the famine would be severe and the plenty of the 7 good years would be forgotten because of the severity of the famine. Notice then that the provision that's made for the Egyptians and Canaanites and Joseph's crisis management. It's interesting, first of all, isn't it, that there's no free handouts. People have to pay for the grain, whether it's the money until that's all used up, then their livestock until they're all gone, and then their themselves and their lands. It's not a free handout. It's interesting. Those who benefit pay, not succeeding generations. That's what's going to happen, isn't it, after this crisis in our country? There's been free handouts, and the succeeding generations are going to have to pay back in taxes what has been borrowed. Well, that's not how Joseph did it. Those who benefit, they pay, and there's an equity, a fairness about that, isn't there? And notice that it's Egyptians who suggest the sale of labor and land in verse 19. Why should we perish before your eyes, we and our land as well? Buy us and our land in exchange of it. It's they who suggest it. It's not Joseph's suggestion. They suggest it. And rather than resenting Joseph for his management, they actually thank him. Verse 25, you have saved our lives. They said, may we find favor in the eyes of our Lord. They didn't resent Joseph. They were grateful to him for the way that he handled this crisis. And notice also in this crisis, Pharaoh recognizes the importance of religion. Verse 20, Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's. Joseph reduced the people to servitude from one end of Egypt to the other. Verse 22, however, he did not buy the land of the priests because they received a regular allotment from Pharaoh and had food enough from the allotment Pharaoh gave them. That is why they did not sell their land. Pharaoh recognized the importance of religion. That's a lesson, isn't it, for our society? Now, that's the last thing our government has been bothered about. But religion is false religion in Egypt. But Pharaoh recognizes the importance of religion to his people. That our government would share that reckoning. Notice also the reasonable tax rate that Joseph imposes there in verse 26, in verse 24, when the crop comes in, give 1/5 of it to Pharaoh. The other 4/5 you may keep as seed for the fields and as food for yourselves and your households and your children. Joseph established it as a law, verse 26, concerning land in Egypt, still in force today. That's when Moses is writing, 450 years later, whatever. That 1/5 of the produce belongs to Pharaoh. That's a reasonable tax rate of 1/5 or 20%. The tax burden in the UK is about 33%, 1/3. So there's a very reasonable tax rate that is set in place. And there's proper accounting. Verse 14, Joseph, it says, collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan in payment for the grain they were buying, and he brought it to Pharaoh's palace. There was no sleaze. The money went to where it should go. There's some good principles of crisis management. But the main purpose of recounting this provision for the Egyptians and the Canaanites is to contrast it with the Israelites. So notice, verses 11 and 12, Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt, gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramesses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his family, his brothers, and all his father's household with food according to the number of their children. Then we have related about the Egyptians and the Canaanites. Then verse 27, now the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. So it's like bookends on either side of the story of Joseph's provision for the Israelites and the Egyptians and the Canaanites is Joseph's provision for the Israelites. And so we're having a contrast set between how it fared for the Israelites and how it fared with the Egyptians and Canaanites. That contrast is brought out particularly in verses 12 and 13. It's a shame the NIV's put a big paragraph there in my Bible here. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their children. There was no food, however, in the whole region because the famine was severe. There's actually, in the Hebrew, there's only two words between the food in verse 12 and the food in verse 13. Joseph provided for all his family food for their dependents. Food there was not in the rest of the region. So you see that contrast? Joseph provides food. There's no food anywhere else. That contrast is being made very clear. So here's the contrast then. Food is provided freely. Joseph provided food. He gave food to his family. The contrast is food is bought at great cost. For the Israelites, food is provided freely. For the Egyptians and Canaanites, food is bought at great cost. All their money goes, all their livestock goes, their land and their labor goes. The Israelites are settled. Verse 11, Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt. And again, that's made clear in verse 27. Now the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. And I think that's contrasted with the Egyptians being moved. That's not brought out in the NIV in verse 21. It says Joseph reduced the people to servitude. You'll notice there's a footnote in the NIV there. They're following the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. The Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, says he moved the people in cities. Joseph moved the people. So it's not that he reduced the people to servitude, he moved them. And the translator, Alter, says this, the purpose would be to sever them from their hereditary lands and locate them on other lands that they knew were theirs to till only by the grace of Pharaoh, to whom the land now belonged. The Egyptians are moved. The Israelites settle. They have land. Property is acquired by the Israelites. Again, notice verse 11, Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land of the district of the Ramesses. Again, verse 27, the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there. The Israelites are acquiring property. What's happening to the Egyptians? They're selling it. See this contrast that's being drawn between the lot of these peoples. The result for the Israelites is that they were fruitful and increased greatly in number. That's exactly what God had promised to Jacob. Go down to Egypt, I'll make you into a great nation. Well, they are fruitful and increasing in number greatly at a time of famine because of God's provision for them through Joseph. They are delivered from the stresses facing the rest of the population because of the provision that God through Joseph makes for them. Well, don't we too have an all-powerful representative at the heart of the government of the universe who will provide for us? Here is Joseph, the representative of the family, at the heart of government. making sure that they're provided for. Well, we have a brother, the Lord Jesus, at the heart of the government of the universe, ensuring that we are provided for, so that we don't have to succumb to the stress of those around us. We have Christ there, making sure that we're provided for. Now, I'm not suggesting this is prosperity gospel, that we'll have plenty when everyone is suffering. No, it's our spiritual well-being that Christ is concerned for and will provide for. Spiritual sustenance. He'll give us bread, food. What does it say in Isaiah? Come buy food without money, without cost. It's free. Spiritual sustenance. People around us are starving spiritually. We are provided for. There is stability for us. We are settled. There's stability for us as Christ's people. There's possession for us, promised in glory, an eternal possession that will never be taken from us. Christ, at the heart of the government of the universe, ensures that we are provided for. All our needs are met. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Christ is all to us that Joseph was to his family there in Egypt. Provision, secure, safe, plentiful for God's people. Provision. But then secondly, we go on to read of promise. Promise. As we leave Joseph's management of the crisis into verse 28 and onwards, we read that Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years. There's a sweet symmetry there, isn't there? Joseph was with Jacob for his first 17 years before he was sold into slavery. Jacob is with Joseph for his last 17 years before his death. That sweet symmetry. He lived for 17 years. That means he was in Egypt for 12 years after the end of the famine. They went after the end of the second year of famine. So then there were the remaining 5 years of famine. So Jacob is there for 12 years after the end of the famine. The Israelites are settled. Jacob secures a solemn promise from Joseph regarding his burial. As his death approaches, he secures this solemn promise from Joseph regarding his burial. Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life were 147. When the time drew near for Israel to die, he called for his son Joseph and said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh." Abraham had told his servant to do that when he went to get a wife for Isaac. Back in chapter 46 and verse 27, we perhaps get an idea what this means. In chapter 46 and verse 27, it says, "All those who went to Egypt with Jacob, those who were his direct descendants," literally those who came forth from his thigh. Perhaps this is a pledge on my descendants. I'm asking you to take this oath on the life of my descendants. That's what's perhaps being pictured by putting his hand under his thigh. People make a promise on their grandmother's grave, don't they, or on their children's grave? Well, that's perhaps the idea here. On the life of my descendants. He's appealing to Joseph's family bonds. He says, "If I have found favor in your eyes, show me kindness and faithfulness." He's appealing to Joseph's love, favor, kindness, faithfulness. He actually says please 3 times in this request. If I can show you where that is. In verse 29, when he begins to speak to Joseph, he says, "If, please, I have found favor in your eyes, Put, please, your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not, please, bury me in Egypt. But when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt, bury me where they're buried. Please, please, Joseph, do this for me. And Joseph says at the end of verse 30, I will do as you say. Swear to me, Jacob says. Then Joseph swore to him. So he's said he'll do it, but Jacob says, you've got to swear to me that you will do it. This is a solemn, serious promise. And Jacob brings all this weight to bear on Joseph in asking regarding this promise to bury him with his family in Canaan. Again, we remember that we've noticed before that burial is the Bible norm at death. The body, our body is not waste material to be burnt or dismembered. It's integral to my identity. And that's important today in our society. Your body is integral to your identity. We are embodied souls. And so he wants his body buried there in Canaan. Now, Jacob, as he thinks about his burial, he's not concerned about the pomp and pageantry of his burial. Prince Philip made sure that all the pomp and pageantry was in place for his burial. He had arranged all that went on. Jacob is not bothered about the pomp and pageantry. He's concerned about the place of his burial. It's the place that matters. Do not please bury me in Egypt. But when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried. At the end of chapter 49, this is demanding Joseph to do this. At the end of chapter 49, he gives all his sons this same instruction. Chapter 49, verse 29, then he gave them, his sons, he gave them these instructions. I'm about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite, along with the field. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites. Very clear instructions about the place. Why is it important? Why is it important where Jacob is buried? He says, I'm going to rest with my fathers. He's not talking about his burial there. When I rest with my fathers, bury me there. And we'll think a bit more later what that, on a future occasion, what that means, that phrase, resting with my fathers. I think Joyce Baldwin gets it exactly right in her The Bible Speaks Today commentary on Genesis. Jacob, for his part, wanted to make the family fully aware that they did not belong in the land of Egypt. They'd been there 12 years now after the famine. They haven't gone back. They're settled. But Jacob wants to make the family fully aware that they did not belong to the land of Egypt, lest his successors should forget their commitment to the covenant with the Lord their God, who had promised them the land of Canaan. Joyce Baldwin goes on to say, nothing could point more forcibly to the land of the promise than a funeral there, in the family tomb, the cave of Machpelah. And all that new generation would know that their ancestors were buried where they essentially belonged, in the land of Canaan. That's why Jacob is concerned, to make sure that he's buried there, so that it's a testimony to his family regarding where his hope was in God's promise. I wonder if you've prepared your burial and funeral as a testimony to what you believe. Do prepare your burial and funeral. That will help your family when the time comes. But do it in a way that's going to testify to those who are there what you believe, where your hope is, where your heart is. Jacob wants to ensure that he leaves this testimony. He draws this promise from Joseph because he's trusting in God's promise to him. That's the promise that underlines what's going on here. God's promise regarding possession of the land that was to the patriarchs, as we see in Hebrews 11, a symbol, a sign of the heavenly country that God had promised. Provision, promise, and then at the very end of the chapter, posture. Verse 31, swear to me, Jacob said. Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. He worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. All the other versions that people are reading will say that he bowed down on the top of his bed. The NIV, again, it follows the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. The Hebrew, the Masoretic text says on the top of his bed. But on this occasion, the consonants are the same for these two words. Bed is mitar, staff is mater. So it's the same consonants with different vowels. And the vowels were added by the Masoretic Hebrew scribes about 600 AD. And so I think it's much more likely to be staff. I think the NIV is right to follow the Septuagint, written perhaps 700 years before the Masoretic vowels were added. And one writer notes that bas-relief and specimens of Egyptian beds that have been preserved show us that the head of an Egyptian bed was scarcely higher than 6 inches. They're not like our bed heads, our headboards. They were very small, the heads of an Egyptian bed. It's not something that you would bow down on. Hebrews 11 and verse 21 refers to this event. Hebrews 11 verse 21 says, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. So the writer of the Hebrews follows the Septuagint as he relates to this thing. I think the NIV is wrong to say he leaned on the top of it. He bowed down. It's a word that's used of worship. You bow down to God. You bow down to the Lord. It's used earlier in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 5. Abraham has taken Isaac to sacrifice him. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship. We will bow down. And then we will come back to you. Abraham's servant, when he goes to collect Isaac's wife, he also bows down in the same way. Chapter 25, verse 52, when Abraham's servant heard what Rebekah's family said, he bowed down to the ground before the Lord. It's a posture of worship. Israel worshipped on the top of his staff. He worshipped on the top of his staff. His staff was the only possession he took with him when he fled from Esau to Paddan Aram. He says in chapter 32, verse 10, I crossed the Jordan with just my staff. Now, at the end of his life, what a difference. A family provided for generously. Philip Hughes, commenting on the passage in Hebrews, says, Jacob, triumphant in faith, even at the approach of death, bowed over his own staff in submission to the divine will and acknowledgement of the divine goodness. I think Jacob probably would have bowed down to the ground if he could have done, but he's 147. He can't get down to the ground and get up again. So he just bows down on his staff to demonstrate his submission to God. Lord, how good you have been. I submit to you how faithful you have been in providing for me down these years and now at death. It's an act of worship with his posture, bowing down in worship on the top of his staff. I think this passage is really about the Israelites as a people apart. A people apart. They're provided for. They're not swept up with the crisis that envelops Egypt and Canaan. They are a people apart, provided for in this time of crisis. They're a people apart because of the promises that God has made to them. I'm not going to be buried in Egypt. I don't belong here. I want to be buried in the land that God has promised. We don't belong here. We're a people apart. There are a people apart in worship. Jacob worships God. He's a worshipper. And that sets him apart from those around him. Yes, they've got priests there worshipping false gods. He worships the God who has been faithful and good and dependable across those years, and gracious to Jacob with all his failings and faults. God's people are people apart. Is that true of us? Is that clear of us? Is that evident of us? That we're a people apart by God's grace and for God's glory. Amen. We're going to sing, I will sing the wondrous story of the Christ who died for me.